They thought it was just grief, a dog sitting at a grave, refusing to leave. But then it started barking, loud, desperate, day and night. No matter what they did, the dog wouldn't stop. Something wasn't right. When authorities finally opened the coffin, what they found inside sent shivers down everyone's spine. Dogs are known for their loyalty, but this story takes that to a whole new level. It's a heartbreaking, mysterious, and shocking tale of a dog who knew something no one else did. What could be so terrifying that even the grave couldn't hide it? Why was this dog so determined? Stick around, because this is one story you won't forget. It all started in a small town, peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where big mysteries didn't happen. People lived simple lives. Routines rarely changed, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But that was about to change. One crisp autumn morning, the Carson family noticed something unusual. Max, their loyal German shepherd, was gone. At first, they weren't too concerned. Max was an adventurous dog. He loved running through the open fields, chasing birds, and exploring every hidden corner of the town. Sometimes, he would disappear for a few hours and return just in time for dinner, wagging his tail as if nothing had happened. But this time felt different. By afternoon, Max still wasn't home. The Carsons called out his name, whistled, even shook his favorite box of treats, but there was no sign of him. Worried, they set out to search. They checked all his usual spots, the lake, the park, even the backyard of their neighbor Mr. Jenkins, where Max often snuck in to steal bones from his bulldog. But Max was nowhere to be found. Then, just as the sun started dipping below the horizon, they found him, sitting completely still in the town cemetery. At first, it seemed normal. Well, as normal as a dog sitting by a grave could be. But something about the way Max was positioned sent chills down their spine. He wasn't just sitting there. He was staring, his body stiff, his ears twitching at the slightest sound, his eyes locked on the ground, as if something beneath the dirt had caught his attention. And then he barked, a single, sharp bark that cut through the silence like a warning. The grave he was fixated on belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an elderly woman who had passed away just a few days earlier. The Carsons knew her. Everyone in town did. She was the kind old lady who used to sit on her porch, handing out cookies to children as they walked by. Max had always been friendly with her, running up to greet her, wagging his tail whenever she called his name. But now, there was no tail wagging, no playful excitement, just stillness. And that strange, unsettling bark. The Carsons tried calling Max away, but he wouldn't budge. They tried pulling at his collar, but he dug his paws into the ground, refusing to move. By now, the sky had turned dark. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, making the atmosphere even eerier. The Carsons decided to leave, assuming Max would eventually follow. But he didn't. That night, Max did something no one could explain. He barked, loud, desperate, almost as if he were pleading. It started as a soft whimper, long, drawn-out sounds that carried through the cold night air. But as the hours passed, his barks grew frantic. He wasn't barking at random. He was barking at the grave. People in nearby houses woke up to the noise. Lights flickered on as curious neighbors peeked through their windows, wondering what was going on. By midnight, a few of them decided to investigate. They found Max exactly where the Carsons had left him, sitting by Mrs. Thompson's grave, staring, barking, refusing to move. Some of the older folks in town started whispering. "This isn't normal," one of them muttered. "Maybe he's just mourning," another suggested, though their voice held doubt. But deep down, everyone felt it. Something wasn't right. By the next morning, word had spread. More people gathered at the cemetery, watching as Max continued his strange behavior. And then the scratching started. Max didn't just bark anymore. He dug. At first, it was just light scratching, his paws scraping against the dirt in short, rapid movements. But as the minutes passed, he became more frantic. His claws tore into the ground, sending small chunks of dirt flying. His breathing grew heavy, desperate, like he was racing against something unseen. The crowd murmured, unease creeping into their voices. "Why is he doing that?" someone asked. Maybe there's something down there," another person whispered. An unsettling silence followed those words. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, but they were all thinking it. What if? No, it wasn't possible. Or was it? For the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Max refused to leave. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't rest. He just barked and dug. By now, the entire town was talking about it. Some believed Max was just grieving in his own way. Others weren't so sure. Then came the final straw. On the third night, something happened that sent chills through everyone who was there. A sound, a faint, almost inaudible sound, coming from beneath the ground. At first, they thought they were imagining it. The wind, the rustling leaves, their own paranoia playing tricks on them. But then they heard it again, a weak, muffled knocking. The murmurs turned into gasps. A few people stepped back, shaking their heads in disbelief. No, it couldn't be. Someone ran to call the authorities. The police arrived, skeptical at first. They listened, knocked on the coffin's surface. Silence. One of the officers sighed, shaking his head. Folks, sometimes dogs just act weird. There's nothing here. But just as he turned to leave, a knock, louder this time. It came from inside the coffin. The officer froze. The color drained from his face. Everyone's breath hitched. A woman covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. And then, a weak, broken cry for help. It was coming from inside the coffin. Chaos erupted. People shouted. Some ran. Others stood frozen in shock. Max barked louder than ever, his entire body trembling, as he clawed at the dirt with everything he had. There was no more doubt. Someone or something was inside that grave. There was only one thing left to do. They had to open the coffin, and when they did, what they found inside would haunt them forever. Rumors spread like wildfire. By now, almost everyone in town had heard about Max, the dog that wouldn't leave the grave. Whispers filled the streets, markets, and cafes, each person adding their own version of what might be happening. Some believed Max was sensing something unnatural, something beyond the grave, something only animals could perceive. Ghost stories started circulating. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson had always been kind, but there were murmurs about her past. Some people claimed she had been hiding secrets. Others suggested that perhaps she had never truly left. But others, they had a very different fear. What if Mrs. Thompson wasn't actually dead? It sounded impossible, unthinkable, but history said otherwise. There had been real cases, documented cases, where people were mistakenly buried alive. The thought alone sent shivers through people's spines. The idea that someone could be trapped, buried beneath the earth, with no way out. It was the kind of nightmare people only read about in books. But this wasn't a book. This was real. And Max, he seemed to be the only one who knew the truth. The town's authorities were skeptical. Exhuming a body wasn't something that could be done on a whim. There were legal procedures, approvals, things that took time. And let's be honest, no one wanted to believe that something like this was possible. The local sheriff, a man in his late 50s, scratched his head when he heard the reports. A dog digging up a grave doesn't mean there's something wrong, he told the townspeople. Maybe the old woman used to feed him, and he just misses her. But the town wasn't convinced. Max's behavior was too unusual, too specific. He wasn't just hanging around. He was digging, barking, crying, refusing to move. And he wasn't stopping. The Carsons pleaded with the authorities. "You don't understand," Mr. Carson said, frustration in his voice. "He's never acted like this before. Something is wrong." The sheriff sighed. "I can't just go digging up graves because of a barking dog." He turned to leave. And then, Max lunged forward, barking wildly, snapping at the sheriff's boots. His entire body trembled with frustration. His eyes locked onto the dirt beneath him. The sheriff had seen a lot in his lifetime, but this unsettled him. Still, his hands were tied. There were rules. Without solid proof, they couldn't just open up a grave. At least, not legally. The tension in town kept rising. Days passed. Max refused to eat. His once bright, golden fur became matted with dirt from his endless digging. His paws were raw, bleeding from his efforts to claw through the ground. Then came the final straw. It was just past midnight. A group of restless townspeople, too anxious to sleep, gathered at the cemetery. They had flashlights, warm jackets, and a growing sense of dread. Max was still there, still digging, still barking, still desperate. The wind howled through the trees, making the cemetery feel colder than it should have been. And then, a sound, faint, barely there, a whisper carried by the wind. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, the leaves rustling, the shifting earth. But then, they heard it again, a muffled cry, a weak, desperate knock. No one spoke, no one moved. They just stood there, their breath frozen in their throats, because now, there was no denying it. Something, or someone, was trying to get out. Panic set in. People screamed. Others backed away in terror. Some refused to believe what they had just heard. This isn't happening," one man muttered. "It can't be happening." But it was. Someone ran to get the sheriff. This time, there was no hesitation. The authorities arrived within minutes, but no one knew what to do. One of the officers, a younger man in his 30s, looked pale. "Are we sure about this?" he asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, he walked up to the grave and crouched down. Knock, knock, silence. For a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, they had imagined it all. Then, knock, 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 from inside the coffin. The sheriff jumped back, face draining of color. The other officers exchanged horrified glances. There's someone in there. The order was given immediately. Dig. Now, the townspeople didn't wait for permission. They grabbed shovels, their hands moving as fast as humanly possible. Dirt flew in every direction, some people working with their bare hands. The minutes felt like hours. Max was barking wildly, his body tense with urgency. They reached the wooden coffin. It was still sealed shut. The sheriff hesitated for only a second before nodding. Open it. A crowbar was shoved into the lid. Someone counted. 1, 2, 3. Crack. The coffin lid snapped open, and what they saw inside would haunt them forever. A body, but not a corpse. A living, breathing person. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. She was alive. Her frail hands were pressed against the coffin lid. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale as death, her eyes wide with terror. The townspeople gasped. Some people fell to their knees, unable to process what they were seeing. Mrs. Thompson's chest rose and fell, weak but moving. She was breathing. She was alive. Barely. Max let out a whimper, then a sharp, relieved bark. The entire town had been wrong. Max had been right all along. Mrs. Thompson had been buried alive. How? The doctors later explained it was a rare medical condition, one that made her heartbeat slow to a near undetectable level. To the doctors who had examined her, she had seemed dead. No pulse, no breath. But she wasn't. She had been aware, trapped in her own body, buried 6 feet under. The moment she woke up inside the coffin, panic set in. She screamed. She clawed. She knocked. But no one heard, except for Max. Mrs. Thompson was rushed to the hospital. It took weeks, but she survived. She made a full recovery, though the nightmares of what she had been through would never fully go away. As for Max, he became a legend. The town never forgot what he did. And Mrs. Thompson, she never let him out of her sight again, because without Max, she would still be buried in that coffin, forever. Candlelight flickered in the hands of those who had gathered, their faces pale with anticipation. The cold night air wrapped around them like an unseen presence, heavy with dread. The cemetery, usually a place of quiet mourning, had transformed into something far more sinister, a battleground between life and death. Authorities had finally given in. The constant pleas of Max, the undeniable scratching, the terrifying whispers of something moving beneath the ground. None of it could be ignored any longer. A team of workers, shovels in hand, stood at the edge of Mrs. Thompson's grave, their expressions tense. The mayor himself was present, rubbing his temples, still hesitant about what they were about to do. If this turns out to be nothing but a dog's obsession, we'll be in trouble, he muttered under his breath. But he knew, deep down, that the town would never forgive him if he ignored the possibility that something, or someone, was trapped beneath the earth. The first shovel struck the ground. A hush fell over the crowd as dirt was lifted, one heavy scoop at a time. The soil was fresh, still damp from the recent burial. Each scrape of the shovel sent shivers down spines. The deeper they dug, the more the reality of what they were doing set in. And then it happened. A sound, so faint, so weak, it was almost lost beneath the noise of shovels. But Max heard it. He let out a sharp, high-pitched whimper and started scratching at the ground wildly. The workers froze, staring at one another, their hands trembling. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. It had sounded like a knock, another muttered, his face turning pale. Then it came again, a muffled thud, like fingers desperately hitting against wood. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Some stepped back, as if afraid of what they were about to uncover. Others leaned in, their curiosity outweighing their fear. "Hurry up," someone shouted. The workers dug faster, throwing soil aside in frantic movements. The mayor pulled out his phone, already dialing emergency responders. The grave was deeper than expected, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, the top of the coffin was visible. Max let out an agonized howl. His body trembled as he pawed at the wooden surface. His eyes, full of desperation, told them what they already feared. "Open it!" a woman in the crowd screamed. The coffin lid was nailed shut, sealing whatever was inside. The lead worker grabbed a crowbar, his hand slick with sweat. His breathing was ragged as he positioned it beneath the lid and pushed with all his strength. The nails groaned, the wood cracked, and then, with a sharp creak, the coffin lid snapped open. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gasps came. Inside the coffin, barely breathing, was Mrs. Thompson. Her face was ghostly pale, her lips dry and cracked. Her frail hands were clawed, her fingernails broken and caked with blood from where she had desperately scratched at the coffin lid. But her chest, it moved. She was alive. A mixture of relief and horror rippled through the crowd. The mayor stumbled back, his face frozen in shock. A woman covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The workers, who had been prepared for the worst, found themselves staring at the impossible. A woman who had been buried for days, still alive. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered open. She sucked in a shallow, rattling breath. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the cold night air. That was all it took. The medics rushed forward, checking her pulse, wrapping her frail body in blankets, lifting her from the coffin with the utmost care. People whispered prayers. Some fell to their knees, overcome with emotion. But Max didn't move. He sat at the edge of the coffin, staring down at the woman he had fought so hard to save. His tail didn't wag. His ears didn't perk up in excitement. It was as if he knew. This wasn't a moment for celebration. This was a moment of miracle and terror intertwined. Because the truth was horrifying. Mrs. Thompson had been buried alive. Somehow, some way, she had been mistakenly declared dead. Perhaps her heartbeat had been too weak to detect. Perhaps a simple error had cost her days of agony beneath the ground. But the real question remained. How had she survived? The doctors had no answers. Her body was weak, dehydrated, her skin cold as ice. But she had managed to hold on, clinging to whatever small hope remained. And that hope, that final thread keeping her alive, was Max. He had sensed what no human had. He had refused to let her be forgotten, refused to accept what the rest of the world had assumed. He had saved her life. Tears streamed down the faces of those watching as the medics carried Mrs. Thompson away. Some wept in horror at what she had endured, others in relief that she had been found in time. But for Max, none of it mattered. His job was done. As the ambulance doors closed, he let out one last, deep sigh. Then, for the first time in days, he turned and walked away. The town never forgot what had happened that night. The graveyard was no longer just a place of mourning. It was a place of second chances, of miracles, of the unbreakable bond between man and dog. And Max, he became a legend, a symbol of loyalty, love, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the ones who see beyond life and death aren't human at all. Mrs. Thompson was rushed to the hospital, her frail body barely holding on. The paramedics worked quickly, placing an oxygen mask over her face, checking her vitals, and wrapping her in blankets to warm her ice-cold skin. She had been buried alive for days. No food, no water, barely any air, yet she had survived. But how? The moment she arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses surrounded her, their faces filled with disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before. A woman, declared dead, buried, and somehow still breathing? It defied all logic. They ran test after test, trying to make sense of the impossible. And then, they found the answer. Mrs. Thompson had a rare medical condition called catalepsy, a neurological disorder that can make a person appear dead. Their pulse slows down to the point where it's nearly undetectable. Their breathing becomes shallow, and their muscles become rigid. Even experienced doctors can mistake this for actual death. And that's exactly what had happened. The town's doctor, the funeral home staff, everyone had believed she was gone. They had prepared her body, held a funeral, and buried her 6 feet under, never suspecting that she was still alive. The horror of it was almost too much to bear. Imagine waking up in total darkness, the weight of earth pressing down on you, your screams swallowed by the silence. Imagine clawing at the wooden coffin, hoping, praying that someone would hear you. No one had, no one except Max. When the news broke, the entire town was in shock. People who had attended Mrs. Thompson's funeral, who had stood by her grave in mourning, now realized they had unknowingly buried her alive. Whispers of guilt spread like wildfire. How could we have let this happen? Did no one double-check? What if there were others? Some people blamed the doctors. Others blamed the funeral home. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. If it weren't for Max, Mrs. Thompson would have never been found in time. Max, the stray dog no one paid much attention to, had sensed what no human could. He had refused to leave, refused to be ignored, and because of him, a life had been saved. It wasn't just loyalty, it was something deeper. As Mrs. Thompson regained her strength, one question haunted her. Why did Max save me? Max wasn't her pet. He had never lived in her house, never been fed by her, never been treated as family. He was just a dog from the neighborhood, one of the many strays that roamed the streets. Yet, when no one else heard her cries, he did. Some people said it was just a dog's sharp hearing, that maybe he had picked up the faintest sounds from beneath the earth. Others believed in something more. Dogs have a sixth sense, one old man said. They can see what we cannot, feel what we ignore. And then, someone remembered something. Mrs. Thompson used to leave out a small bowl of water in front of her house. Every evening, Max would come by, take a sip, and sit on her porch for a while. She never chased him away, never ignored him. She never owned him, but she never turned him away either. Maybe, in his own way, Max had always been watching over her. Maybe to him, she was family. The mayor of the town, still shaken by what had happened, made a public statement. This incident has made us realize how fragile life is. It has also made us question how we treat those who cannot speak for themselves, both humans and animals. He announced new regulations that required multiple confirmations before a person could be declared dead. Autopsies, second opinions, extended waiting periods. Everything would change to ensure that what happened to Mrs. Thompson never happened again. But that wasn't the only change. Max, the stray who had saved a life, became a hero. People who had once ignored him now stopped to pet him, offer him food, even invite him into their homes. But Max, he never stayed in one place for long. He still wandered the streets, still sat on Mrs. Thompson's porch every evening, but he never barked at the graveyard again. His job was done. Mrs. Thompson fully recovered after weeks in the hospital, but the experience had left a permanent mark on her soul. She spoke about it only once, to a journalist who had come to write about the miracle dog. People keep asking me what it felt like, being trapped down there, she said. They want to know if I was afraid, if I lost hope. She took a deep breath. I did. I thought I was going to die in that coffin. I screamed until my voice gave out. I scratched at the wood until my fingers bled. And then I stopped. I just waited, because I knew no one was coming. Her voice trembled, but then a small smile appeared. But someone did. A dog. She wiped a tear away, laughing softly. I don't know how or why Max knew, but I do know one thing. He didn't do it for a reward. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because that's what love is. Love is hearing a voice when no one else does. Love is refusing to walk away when everyone else does. Love is Max, and maybe, just maybe, that's what real loyalty looks like. The town never forgot what happened. Mrs. Thompson lived for many more years, always keeping a special place for Max in her heart. And Max, he remained a legend, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected heroes walk among us on four legs. Not because they have to, not because they are asked to, but because they choose to. If this story gave you chills, make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. Who knows, maybe your pet knows something you don't.